level about your neighborhoods, so that you understand, hopefully, how this proposed ordinance may impact your neighborhood, and also how the existing ordinance impacts your neighborhood and why we're trying to change it. So we have invited folks who have expressed interest, as well as some individuals who didn't necessarily express an interest directly to us, but we reached out to these individual neighborhoods listed here, and I do believe we have representatives from most of the neighborhoods on this call. And we will, as we were referencing earlier, right before we got started, we are recording this, and we will make this video available to on our YouTube channel, and we'll be able to provide a link to that channel to each of you. Feel free to share it with your neighbors if they would like to watch what we've discussed this evening. So the first thing we're going to do is a little bit of interactive stuff here. We're going to pose to each of you to see what you know about, what you believe you know about infill residential development in Kansas City. So that's the question. And I'll ask that Matt, if you can, if you're able to share that poll with everyone. And then what you should see on your end, everyone, is this question posed to you, and you can answer the question. It's just a good way of gauging what you think you might know now versus we'll ask you again at the end, just to see if there's anything that you've learned, and it'll also help you evaluate whether you have any more questions, hopefully.
And Joe, unfortunately, those who have been promoted actually cannot participate in this poll for some reason.
Okay, I was wondering. Well, if you've been promoted, you can feel free to just verbally say if you feel like you know. If you don't have to say anything either. We'll just give it a few seconds here. Robin knows a little bit. Dina knows enough to be dangerous. And Klaus knows very little. That's okay. Cynthia knows a little. Not calling anyone out here. I mean, it's not something that many people know much about. So don't worry about that at all. All right. Thanks everyone for jumping in. I appreciate that. So here's how tonight will go. We've done our introductions. We will jump into next an overview of the proposed ordinance, what it means for you and your neighborhood. And a lot of that will be able to convey through discussing your questions. We'll also then go through what's next. What is the next step? What happens next? And of course, we'll have, like as I mentioned minutes ago, multiple opportunities for you to pose questions to us. So what is the purpose of what we're trying to do? The purpose is to amend Chapter 88 of the City Code. The Chapter 88 is the zoning ordinance. Most cities have a zoning ordinance. This is a pretty common regulatory tool. And what it does is it controls how property within the city can be developed. And what we're specifically proposing to do is to change the procedures for minor subdivisions, which is a method of creating lots for development, and propose changes to the standards for how those lots are being developed, how the actual structures on those properties would be developed. The amendments, if approved, would support provision of new housing and reinvestment in existing housing stock throughout the city, particularly in areas where the infrastructure and services are already available. So we obviously have new development that happens on the fringes of the city where new infrastructure has to be extended, oftentimes to serve those neighborhoods. What this ordinance would do is not create new opportunities for development within the existing areas of the city, but make those opportunities that do exist a bit easier. And the goal is to do so in exchange for ensuring that the development that occurs on that property is contextually appropriate. And we'll get into a lot more detail about what that means as well. And the next thing we want to try to talk about is what is development. So development is really anything, any building, construction, or renovation. So if you're a homeowner and you want to build a deck on your house or replace the deck, when you're doing that, you are a developer. You might not think of yourself as one, but for the purposes of this conversation, you are a developer. Anytime a material change in the use of a property is proposed, or the appearance of a property and the structure on the property, that is a form of development. The division of land into parcels or lots for development is a form of development. And finally, any change in the intensity or use of land is a form of development as well. So there are two pictures shown here. One at the top right is a picture of a modern single family home. This ordinance doesn't necessarily advocate one or the other, but what we're trying to show you with these photographs is that both of these images are types of development. Who are developers? As I previously mentioned, you may be a developer if you're a homeowner and you're building a deck. It could also be, as these definitions illustrate, a individual, corporation, partnership, or entity who owns property with the intent to invest on that property or develop on that property. Or in the case of Thornton, Colorado, who defines it as improving a parcel of land within the city, even if you're not the owner. So sometimes a developer may be the contractor you hire to replace the deck. Could be all of the above. The next step, question to answer here is, what is infill development? Infill development is the development on any piece of ground which is surrounded by developed structures. So any area or neighborhood in the city that is mainly developed or mostly developed or was historically developed, is anytime you have development going on within that area, that we would call that infill development. And this image here shows you, as I toggle here, you see these lines on the middle lot here. The green lines and black lines, the green just shows you what might be built, what we call in our industry a building envelope. Shown here in green right now is what could be built on this property under the current ordinances. And then shown here is what would be allowed to be built under the proposed ordinance. So again, we're talking about how you're creating the lot in question, that this piece that is shown here in this image, as well as what you can build on that lot in terms of its size and scale. Another thing we want to share with you is the current process. You heard me mention earlier that we're not creating with this ordinance any new opportunity. We're just making the existing opportunities easier. And so this flow chart here depicts our current process. The first thing to ask yourself, whether you're someone who thinks of yourself as a developer and is used to going through that process, or whether you're someone who's just trying to build on a vacant lot, is, does my lot meet the current code requirements? This is the oval in the top left. If the answer to your question is yes, and oftentimes if you're asking that question, you're talking to me or my staff. If the answer to that question is yes, you're fortunate because you can go straight to building permit, which is usually about a week to 2 weeks long, and then you have your permit and you can start building. In the case of a deck, it's one that you get it the same day. And there's a lot of variation there. If the answer to that question is no, then the very next thing you have to do is survey the property, which means you have to hire a surveyor to prepare a drawing and physically survey the property. There's time and cost associated with that. Once you've done that, then you need to talk with me and my staff, and we need to help you determine whether you can re-establish your lot to make it conforming. And we'll get into more of that. And whether it's conforming or non-conforming is what helps make you eligible for a building permit to do that work on your deck, for example. If you're eligible to be to reestablish a lot as a minor subdivision, then that's a path you can go down, and you would work with Matt and his colleagues, and that would take anywhere from 2 weeks after your survey is prepared, anywhere from 2 weeks to about 6 weeks, depending on the complexity. And then once that's approved, you would be able to go get your permit. If you need a variance, then that is a approval that is a public hearing process from the Board of Zoning Adjustment. That's an additional 6 to 8 weeks. And there's no guarantee that the board will approve it. So there is a gamble there. If it is denied, you simply can't use your lot for the intended purpose, or you can't build your deck. It doesn't mean you'd have to tear down your house or anything like that if there's an existing house. It just means you can't do what you intended to do. If it's approved, then you can build within the confines of that approval, and you're eligible to go to building permits. But what this illustrates is that if you have a non-conforming lot, there is a process you have to go through to build on it. You would have to either do the minor subdivision or variance and prove one way or another whether your lot was deemed combined at any point in the past. And we'll get into that a little bit more as well. But all of those things take time and money. And of course, add to the cost and the burden of building that house or that deck. What we are proposing is to streamline that process. So again, we're not creating a new opportunity. The opportunity still exists. We're just making it easier, hopefully, for people to achieve their end result. So if you pose the same question to us under the proposed ordinance, and your lot is conforming and meets the requirements, then you can go straight to building permit. If not, then we would be looking to see if you meet the infill lot and building standards, which we're also proposing with this amendment. And if you do, then you'd be able to go to building permit. And if not, you would have to go through a conventional process, which is the process I've just showed you. The next thing I want to do is to try to clarify what by right development is versus an entitlement process, because we do use these terms a lot. So in the previous slides, I was showing you about when you can go straight to building permit. That is a by right process, meaning you've demonstrated to us that your lot is conforming. You've gotten everything you're doing is compliant with city code, so you can just get your building permit and move forward. There's no public hearing process. There's no approval you need other than your permit, which is a staff level approval. An entitlement process, on the other hand, is typically associated with a large project like that you see in the image here, where, and typically is performed by people that we think of as developers, people with teams of design professionals or lawyers and investors that are pursuing major projects like an image shown here. Those folks are used to going through a public hearing entitlement process. They're used to a months-long process to get their project off the ground. They may not like it, but they're used to it. If you're trying to build a house on one lot or expand your house or enclose your porch, you're not necessarily used to that. You're just a homeowner or you're a small-time developer and you're just trying to build a house or trying to build that deck. And so the difference between the two is one of resources, who has resources to do entitlement versus by right, but it's also time, it's also cost. So those are the key differences between the two. And what we're trying to do here with this amendment is make change it to where currently a lot of these folks have to go through some form of an entitlement process. We're trying to make it by right.
Joe, so this is Tiffany. Do you mind if I just jump in for one quick second here?
Sure.
When you say easier, would it be fair to say that it really is about being easier for the applicant, not necessarily all the participants in the current entitlement process?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's fair to say. Yeah.
And without the entitlement process, that more streamlined pathway wouldn't necessarily include many of the folks from the neighborhoods that are attending these calls, right? Removing some of those entitlements does streamline the connection and simplify it so there aren't as many opportunities for the community to engage in what currently does require some touch points, right?
Right. That's fair to say. There's one caveat to that, which is the minor subdivision path, which is an entitlement process, but there's not a public hearing associated with minor subdivisions anyway. So it's one of several types that don't have a public hearing associated with them. The variance process that I outlined does, as you know, it does have a public hearing through the Board of Zoning Adjustment.
Yep. Thanks.
So what I want to show you here is some images, and I'll scroll through both of these and then come back to this first one. But what you see here in these images are conforming lots, houses on lots that conform with today's ordinance requirements. And what you see here in this image are non-conforming lots. And the reason I kind of wanted to show both of them to you back to back is I kind of am curious if you all think that, is there something visibly to you that you see that indicates that one of them's conforming or not? And that's kind of a rhetorical question, but if you think you know something that sees, feel free to jump in and say one of them looks a little different. Okay. So the point of that is that you can't always tell what is conforming or non-conforming just simply by looking at it. What makes these lots conforming and the other ones I showed you in this photograph non-conforming is the zoning of the property. There's nothing inherent about the actual buildings or lots that you can see that makes them non-conforming. And really what it comes down to when it comes to lots is that we have a number of areas of the city that were established prior to zoning or prior to subdivision regulations. So the rules were placed on those areas after they were originally platted or developed. And as a result, they're non-conforming with the rules because they existed before the rules existed. That's one method by which some areas are non-conforming. Another is when areas were downzoned. Oftentimes, we still have some neighborhoods that downzone today, but often the intent of the downzoning is to keep out commercial uses or apartment buildings or some sort of building type that is out of context with the neighborhood. But in the process of downzoning, in many cases, what happened is we increased the minimum lot width and lot area requirements, which resulted in the lots that these, in many cases, single family homes that are on, those lots became non-conforming because they're not big enough, they're not wide enough. And the result of that is that these folks have to go through that entitlement process that we discussed briefly. So we're gonna take some questions here in a moment, but I do wanna share before we do that what this ordinance is not. We've heard a lot of questions, and of course we have a very engaged community, which is something that is great and we're really proud of. There's a lot of conversation about a lot of things right now, and we want to make sure that it's clear to everyone what this is not related to. There's a lot of conversation about affordable housing. This is not an affordable housing ordinance. So we're not trying to make things more affordable. We're not trying to make things less affordable. This is just about the process to build on these lots. There has been some conversation about, does this allow zero lot line housing? This is not a zero lot line housing ordinance. That's a housing type with no setbacks. And as you'll see in a moment, there are setback requirements from the adjacent property lines. Are we trying to regulate green space? How much of people's yards can be developed versus not? No, that's not what this ordinance does either. We're also not trying to control, I realize I'm going from back to front here. I'm sorry, everyone, if you're following along, but I'm right here in the middle of this slide. We're not trying to control the architectural design of the building. You'll see in a moment that we're trying to control the scale of a building, but the design of it is not being controlled with this ordinance. Does this make it easier or harder for out-of-state developers to develop property in Kansas City? We see it as neutral. It's not intended to help anyone other than the people who are trying to build on these individual lots. And does it allow for development people can't already do? No, it doesn't. People, as we've demonstrated, can already do this. It's just a process that is more streamlined. Okay, so with that, let's see what your questions are. And Matt, has anyone dropped in any questions into the Q&A or chat that we need to tackle first?
They have not yet.
Not yet, okay. But Dina has a question. Go ahead, Dina.
I do. So, Joe, why did this come about? I'm just curious. How did all this come about? Was it developers asking for this? Was it residential folk? If it wasn't broke, don't fix it. I'm just curious why this came about.
Right. Most cities, including us, have provisions that allow non-conforming lots to be developed. We have a provision in one section of our ordinance that does allow non-conforming lots to be developed with single-family homes. And we had relied upon that provision for many decades and issued permits regularly on non-conforming lots for single-family homes until about 3 years ago, when our decision to do so was appealed to the Board of Zoning Adjustment. And by our decision, I mean staff's decision. And any staff level decision can be appealed to the Board of Zoning Adjustment. That decision was appealed, and in the course of reviewing it, the Board of Zoning Adjustment found that there is a different provision which says that we can't do that in the event that a lot is narrower than 30 feet and non-conforming, and was deemed combined with an adjacent lot. We, being very upfront with you all, were not aware that that provision existed. It appears to have been something that was added to our ordinance by a consultant in 2011 when we adopted the new ordinance. Having said that, there are other cities that also have the same provision, so it's also not terribly unusual. The board's charge is to overturn a decision if they believe we made an error in our judgment. And they made the right decision. They overturned our decision. And that's because the code also says if there are conflicting provisions within the code itself, that the more restrictive carries. So in that case, the more restrictive provision carried, and the effect that it has, because the Board of Zoning Adjustment is quasi-judicial, is it set a precedent. And that meant that anyone who has a non-conforming lot has to demonstrate that they were never deemed combined, or at least since 2011, have not been deemed combined with an adjacent lot before they can get a building permit on that lot. And so in that sense, it really truly it does apply to someone who's trying to get a building permit. We've had some people who are trying to get electrical permits and there's life safety issues associated with those often. And they've been unable to do that until they're able to prove a chain of title that it was never deemed combined with an adjacent property. So it can be that extreme, and granted, that's not very common, but there also have been many people who have simply wanted to sell a lot that they inherited next to them so that someone can build a house on it. And they've been unable to do that because it was combined since 2011 because they owned both lots. So there's a variety of scenarios. Are there people that most people would consider a developer that are buying several lots from the land bank, for example, and building several houses at once? Yeah, there's people doing that too. But it's a combination of all of those factors over the past 3 years. We have been guiding those customers down the only paths available to them to rectify that situation so that they can build on it. And the paths available are the ones we've talked about, which are the variances and the minor subdivisions, which often we can't approve because we can only approve subdivisions that comply with the ordinance, and these already don't. So that's a very small amount of people. Most of them have to do a variance or a major subdivision and go through planning commission and city council to do that. perform that task, the objective they're trying to achieve. Klaus is asking, how can one tell how a specific lot is zoned? In a moment, Klaus will show you our parcel viewer, or you can see that on parcel viewer, number one. We won't show you parcel viewer, we'll show you a different map. But we can give you a link in this chat to parcel viewer, and you can see there what the zoning of the property is. Does anyone else have a question before we move on to the next phase of the presentation? Someone has their hand raised.
This is Robin. You may have already answered this question, and I apologize, I'm on vacation, but you said that the ordinance is going to streamline the process. In what way specifically is it going to streamline the process?
Okay, so I'm going to do a scenario because that's the easiest way for me to understand. But let's say a very common scenario is someone who's purchased 5 lots, adjoining lots from the land bank. They're undeveloped. They are zoned R7.5, which means that each lot must be a minimum of 7,500 square feet. But in the case of these lots, they're only 5,500 square feet apiece. So they've been deemed combined because they were under common ownership. The land bank owned them, and they cannot be divided back into 5 lots because those 5 lots are non-conforming, and we can't approve that through a minor subdivision. So their path that they have to take in order, if they want to buy those lots from the land bank to build houses, one house on each lot, the path they have to take is either go get a variance from the Board of Zoning Adjustment and to reduce the minimum lot area to 5,500 square feet, or go through a major subdivision process and get the city council to approve lots that are 5,500 square feet. And the variance process, as I mentioned, is an additional 7 weeks approximately at a minimum. And they may or may not approve it. There's quite a lot of risk with that. The major subdivision process is lengthier, and theoretically, at least, it's simpler because you do not have to prove a hardship like you do with the Board of Zoning Adjustment. But both of them are costly because you may have to hire design professionals. In the case of a major subdivision, you would have to hire an engineer or a surveyor to prepare that and go through that process. And the major subdivision process at a minimum is going to take 6 to 8 months to do. So if you're someone who's building 400 apartment units, your bottom line is usually worth the risk of going through a variance or a major subdivision process because you're going to make a fair amount of money on the back end. And you're used to the risk, and so are your investors. But if you're someone who's trying to build on the 5 lots from the land bank and you've never done it before, you're just working with a contractor who's willing to do the work and you think there's a market to buy the houses, you may not be comfortable with that risk. And so what we're finding is that many of those people are simply walking away and not doing anything with the property. And so that is what we see as the problem that we're trying to fix. We don't think anyone wants that. We do think people want the property in their neighborhoods put to a good use. But right now the risk is just too much for some people to tolerate.
Okay, I have another question.
Joe,
Oh, sorry.
this is Tiffany. I want to jump in and then absolutely ask your next question. But I think that it's important to also point out that by removing the variance process, it removes all requirement to get community input or neighborhood input. There would be no notices to adjacent property owners. There would be no notices to neighborhoods, no requirements, because that's all triggered through the entitlement process. And so while it does streamline the applicant's pathway to develop in non-conforming situations, it does remove the community from that process.
Right, and I do on the other side of the coin, I want to point out that until 3 years ago, there was no input requirement. And the reason there is that process now is because that's the only way to remedy the situation that occurred starting 3 years ago. So
yeah,
it was never.
When we get to When
Go
we
ahead.
get to the other part of this, the lot standards, that's less accurate because the lot standard, the variance for that process has always been there. Been, you know, in my neighborhood, we've been doing that for a long time. But the one other point I wanted to throw in there, just for context, and this is where my earlier concern about unintended consequences, most of these conversations are focused on existing infill opportunities and areas that perhaps need more incentive and more investment. But by applying it through the zoning ordinance, it would apply to anything. So if there was a major fire, if there was a tornado in just about any city neighborhood, you know, north of the 85th Street in 6th District, there is always the potential for lots to become available in neighborhoods where we are not currently thinking about infill development. And all of these decisions would be applied in that case.
Right, and we'll get into what qualifies, but generally speaking, that's correct, yeah. I believe that, I'm sorry, was it Robin who had another question? Or follow-up?
Yes, but I don't recall what it is now. However, back going with Tiffany's point, this would remove the neighborhood aspect of it. Has there been any discussion of how we could, I guess, kind of allow for that?
Well, now would be the opportunity to do that. So I would say no, but that's what this is for this evening.
Okay, so if we know that it's important to residents to be able to have an input when there's new development in their communities, then that's what you want. I mean, that's what you want to hear from us. So if you're hearing that from us, then I guess, have there been any discussion around, you know, how to include that to make sure that that is included?
So I want to be very clear that what we're talking about here is someone building a house on a lot. So
Right.
what I'm hearing from you all is that you want there to be an input process for someone to build a house on a lot that meets infill development standards. But if it doesn't meet infill development standards and it's conforming, then there's they don't have to meet. They don't have to have neighborhood input. And I think that I think that's an unintended consequence, but we can look at that more. We can talk about that more. Cynthia, you had your hand raised.
I do, and I think I'm in the same boat as the other two ladies that just spoke. We have quite a few land bank lots. We have a lot of developer interest at the moment, and developers aren't really fantastic about following the rules if they don't have to. And a big part of that is having community input. I guess it's more of a statement than a question. I don't think removing neighborhood input on any kind of infill development is a good idea, unintended consequence or not. If we're the only breaks and we're talking about removing the breaks, it's hard to get on board with making it easier for anyone. Because the small guy isn't going to be the person who's breaking the rules. It's the big developers because they have the resources to do so. I think I'm finished.
Okay. All right, Matt, I'm going to go ahead and we'll move on to the next section. Will there be another opportunity for more questions? Matt, you want to take it over from here and just let me know when you're ready to move to the next slide.
So the next portion of this, which is running kind of simultaneously, is the minor subdivision ordinance. Next slide. So first off, what is a subdivision? You may think of a large neighborhood kind of being built on the outskirts of town. That is a major subdivision. It's how lots are made. Currently, there's two procedural paths to subdivide land. Like I said, major subdivisions are more than 5 lots, so new neighborhoods being platted. But minor subdivisions, which we'll be focusing on today, are currently less than 5 lots, such as, just a couple of lots on a neighborhood being combined or split. We'll get into more about each type here in a minute. Slide. So the current problem is that the zoning and development code is unclear in several ways when it comes to minor subdivisions. The first issue is it conflates eligibility criteria with approval criteria. The second is that it assumes that every subdivider is dividing land into new lots for the purposes of development. And third is any subdivision involving 6 or more lots must be approved through the major subdivision process. Next slide. So the solution is that we remove barriers to the minor subdivisions by streamlining the process. The city approval by right when consolidating lots or when re-establishing lots. So this would be the previous approved platted lots, and we'll get into more of this here in a minute. But over time, some of these lots have been combined, and when they're re-establishing, since it's already been approved by council at some point in time, we would allow that by right. And then second is organize subdivision types by a new naming convention and clarifying eligibility versus approval criteria. And we'll get into those subdivision types here in a second. The third is providing incentives for incremental developers and minor subdivision policies that complement infill development. So next slide. So here are the 4 proposed types of minor subdivisions. Type 1 would be no net increase in lots. So for example, if you have, if you're combining lots, so if you have 2 lots next to each other, you can combine them into 1 lot. This is also for a lot line adjustment where you have 2 lots and you move the lot line back and forth. You still have 2 lots in the end, but they are new sizes. Type 2 is net increase up to 5 lots. So if you're, for example, if you're taking a lot and divide it in half, you now have 2 lots. That is currently the process that we do. Type 3 is the new one that we're proposing, which is a net increase up to 20 lots. So this would be over 5 and less than 20 for a minor subdivision. This would come with some public improvements as well. Type 4 is condominium plats, and this is one that's already existing. Think of a high-rise downtown where each floor is a different owner, or sectioned out as apartments that are individually owned. It's a plat in 3-dimensional space. Next slide.
And Matt, I would speak up just a bit if you can. It's a little hard to hear you.
Okay, I'll pull my computer closer. So, the proposed minor subdivision ordinance allows for the reestablishing of original platted lots, like I said earlier. As you can see on the left is the current, this is an example from our city. There's a current lot that has been combined. On the right, you can see that it is originally 3 lots. The pink lines represent the original platted lots. Those were at one point approved by council. So this minor subdivision ordinance would allow for the reestablishing of those by right. On the next slide, we will see, next slide, see there, just a ground view of that. So on the right is the house that is existing today. On the left are the 2 lots that have been combined with the greenhouse over time. This ordinance will allow for the subdividing to the original 3 lots. Next slide. I guess we'll open up for any questions now.
I don't see anything new in the chat.
So Matt, this is Tiffany. I have a question / comment that Casey Knack has heard from attendees at some of the previous sessions. And I think I heard you present this as the solution. And so one of the common concerns that we're trying to dig into a little bit is whether this is informing the community as to what has been decided, or if this is an engagement opportunity to hear from the community and neighborhood leaders about what changes, what edits, what input they might like to see incorporated in this as it moves through the approval process.
Yeah, so we're trying to do public engagement to kind of feel out. These are not firm solutions by any means. We are just still in the process, and these public engagement meetings are perfect opportunities for.
Okay, great.
See, but none of this is firm in stone yet.
And then one of the questions that I wanted to ask relative to this portion, separate from the lot and building standards, is to Joe, to your point earlier referencing the case from the west side. Is there a pathway to resolving the conflict that was discovered that doesn't make such broad changes? Is it possible for us to look at the conflict that exists in the current language that resulted in that legal case and resolve that in a way that doesn't make as many changes? And did you already look at that? Because in the West Side case, there was a party that won in that BZA ruling because that's what they believed that their property consisted of, right? So each legal encounter has a winner and loser, so to speak. And so there was a party that prevailed because of what they understood their property to be.
Well, Tiffany, I think we'll be able to answer that question well in the next part of the presentation, because I think you'll see that this is a widespread problem. So it is a broad problem. So a broad approach, I think it's fair to characterize it that way, and I think that's what's necessary. That's just the one area that had the one appeal is all it takes, that has the effect of creating this ripple effect citywide. And then it looks like Klaus has a question about, on combined lots, will the zoning be handled if the lots are differently zoned? And so I think the question is if Klaus owns two lots, and because he owns them, they're deemed combined, but one of them zoned one district and one of them zoned the other, to answer your question, it doesn't matter. If one of those two lots is non-conforming with its zoning district, then they're both deemed combined. So if you own 2 lots, 4 lots, 10 lots, whatever, if all it takes is for one of them to be non-conforming, and then they're all combined. And the effect of having them all combined is that you can only build one house on what used to be 10 lots, for example, or 2 lots, you can only build one house. Cynthia, you still have your hand up, but I think that's just from the last time you had a question. Just want to make sure you don't have another one right now. Okay. All right, so we'll go ahead and we'll move on to the next part. So the next part is Matt kind of went over the minor subdivision process, and it's important, the people we've spoken with, the customers we've dealt with on a day in, day out basis have asked for some changes to the subdivision process. And one of the things that we have said is that if we're going to do that, then we're going to push to include lot and building standards that require the development to be contextually appropriate. Because one of the other concerns we've heard throughout the city is that where the infill development is happening, it is often out of scale or context with what's already in the neighborhood. Usually the complaint centers on the building is much bigger in size or taller in size than the rest of the homes in the neighborhood. And so we believe it's essential for these 2 amendments to go hand in hand. And that's why we collectively are referring to them as infill development. So this is really kind of the big picture, the broad picture that I was referencing and responding to Tiffany moments ago. By our analysis, there are at least 23,000 lots in the city that are non-conforming. And those that are deemed combined with adjacent properties are the properties you see in red on this map at the right. So you can see that it is concentrated in certain areas, and some areas more than others, but it is also a citywide issue. We have seen an increase in cases that are utilizing our existing entitlement processes like variances and development plans and major subdivisions in order to fix this issue for their properties. And I want to say what I mean by fix is find a way to get it to where the lot can be built upon. Not that you could honestly believe that there's no need to fix anything, and that's totally fine. But the property owners want to find a path to build something on that lot. And these are the ways available to them. And everywhere else in the city, if your lot's conforming, you don't have to go through an entitlement process. So everything that's not red on this map, there is no public engagement process to build on a lot. But in these areas of the city, there is a requirement to do so. And what bothers us is that they often are correlated with areas where there is a desire for more investment in the community. So essentially our policy in place today makes it harder to invest in areas where we all believe, or most of us do at least, that we want investment to occur. So we're trying to make the burden equal throughout the city and not have it be harder to build a house in the existing built up areas of our community and easier on the fringes of our community. And that's the way it is today. So the lot and building standards that we're proposing would regulate the placement of residential buildings on lots. The current ordinance defines specific development contexts, and for each context, there are different regulations. Those three types currently are conventional, open space, and conservation development. We only have 2 open space developments in the entire city, and neither one of them have been built. They were just approved. So for the purposes of this conversation, everything's conventional. What we're proposing to do with this amendment is create a 4th category of regulations called infill development. And any lot which meets the definition of an infill lot would be required to follow those procedures or those standards. And the next thing I'm going to show you is the map of non-conforming lots. And then after that, we'll get into some more granular information about the individual neighborhoods. And let me see where this is appearing at. Where is my map? Okay, Matt, you can't see the map, can you?
Yeah.
I'm gonna stop and reshare. I apologize, everyone, bear with me. All right. Do you see the map now, Matt?
Yes, sir.
Okay, so this is a map that we prepared to analyze the problem to see how widespread it was. And I am going to this map is available on our website for you to play around with, and we would encourage you to do that. Look in your neighborhood to see what the issues are in your neighborhood. But I'll help you with a little demonstration here. So what we're showing here on this map is non-conforming parcels that are grouped together, which is the red information. These again are any collection of lots which are next to each other where that are under common ownership, where at least one of the lots is non-conforming. And then in purple are all the non-conforming parcels in the city. And I'm going to turn off this later just so you can read it a bit better. But you can see the number of lots in the city, as we zoom in more and more to some of the neighborhoods that you guys are familiar with on the call tonight, there's quite a few that are purple, which are the non-conforming lots. So I just wanted to show you that how widespread this problem might be in your neighborhood, and we'll get into some more detail for each neighborhood here in a moment about what the non-conforming lot issue really is for your neighborhood. All right, I'm going to go back to the presentation.
And I put the link to that non-conforming parcel map in the chat.
Okay, thank you, Matt. Can you see the presentation now, Matt? You said yes, Matt? Okay, thank you. All right, so now that we've looked at that, we can come back to it as needed. So what we're proposing with this amendment would create standards to ensure that what gets built on a non-conforming lot is conforming in terms of size and scale with the houses around it. So the images shown here are examples of what might be considered conforming in terms of size and scale with the existing homes on either side of it. In the top left, what you can see is two houses under construction adjacent to a house on either side that's existing and obviously has been there for some time. The same thing is true for the image on the bottom. The point of this information here is to illustrate that we're not talking about changing how building types are regulated. So in the prior images, you saw single family homes under construction, or what appear to be at least single family homes. There are other building types that the zoning regulations allow or don't allow, depending upon your zoning. So for example, if your zoning district does not allow an apartment building or a duplex, then it would not be allowed with this change. It does not change what building types are allowed. It simply allows a non-conforming lot to be built upon with a building type that is already allowed in that zoning district. And this gives you an idea of the variety of building types that do exist throughout the city. So it would allow in areas that do allow, for example, a duplex, the zoning currently allows for that, or a townhouse, it would allow that building to be built. But again, that building would have to conform to the scale of what's around it. And currently there's no such regulation. So oftentimes the variances that we do see on infill lots are for people who are wanting to build something that is taller than what is currently allowed, or larger than what is currently allowed, or closer to the property lines than what is currently allowed. This would tighten those rules to be such that they are more consistent with what is already around it, on the properties around it. So we wanted to share with you a little bit of the terminology here and how we propose it to be defined. Infill residential development would be any development, whether existing, new construction, or modification to an existing structure on an infill residential lot. You see us using the term residential, and that's because this only applies to our residential zones. This is not related to any commercial uses or non-residential development at all. An infill residential lot is defined as any piece of property described by deed or plat, which was recorded prior to January 1st, 1954, or any piece of land annexed into the city prior to that same date. And this date is important because that was the date that the city first adopted subdivision regulations, which is the part of our ordinance that regulates how lots are created. So any neighborhood created prior to that date, or any lot created prior to that date, did not have rules in place. And so this gets to what I was referencing earlier, where the neighborhood was established and then we applied rules to it later. And in many cases that made these neighborhoods or is certain lots within the neighborhoods non-conforming.
Joe, this is Tiffany. I'm gonna jump in. This is where I have lots of concerns. And as someone who is extremely well versed in the J.C. Nichols developments, they did have rules. Every single block has a set of rules. And these modifications are gonna really make those, not every part
You're cutting out, Tiffany, I think.
or is the same.
Tiffany, I think you cut out a bit. I don't know if we've heard everything you said.
So I am going through kind of a low spot. Can you hear me right now?
Yeah.
So without rules. So what I said is I'm really well versed in speaking. And
Sorry, Tiffany, we can't hear. We can only hear very few bits and pieces. We can't understand what you're saying. Maybe you can, we'll have another opportunity for questions and maybe you'll be in a better spot at that point. So what we're showing here on this slide is a block, an actual block from the Washington Wheatley area. And what you see here, just to orient you, on the left image is the lots in gray lines, and the colors, purple color means that the lot is non-conforming. Most of the time it's non-conforming with regard to lot area. In some cases, it's also due to its width, or a combination of both. The pink or red shaded lot means it's an undeveloped lot. There may have once been a home on that property and it's since been demolished, or maybe there never was a home. But in either case, at the time that this analysis was performed, there was no building on that property. The red dash line are ones that are deemed combined. So in the case of the 4 lots on the left side that are deemed combined, that are reddish or pink color with the red line around them, that means that at least one of them is non-conforming. And in this case, it looks like all 4 are. And they are combined because they're under common ownership. So if someone wants to buy these lots and build 4 homes on them, they cannot do that without going through a major subdivision or a variance process first. They can build 1 house on it by right without any input or public hearing, but they cannot build 4 or 3, for example. And so this gives you an idea of how widespread some of these issues are within the neighborhood. If you're a neighborhood that does want to see some responsible development on the property, especially from small time developers or from individuals who already own property in your neighborhood or live in your neighborhood, this could be very discouraging. I think there was a question posed earlier by Cynthia, does this make it easier for the big guys? The big guys, I think it's fair to characterize, they're used to an entitlement process. So I don't think that this makes it easier for them. I think this makes it easier for people who are not used to the entitlement process and may be scared off from going through that entitlement process. And we can always come back to this if anyone has a question on that. This is an example of the Independence Plaza neighborhood. So what you see in the image on the right is an overall view of the neighborhood. There are not, in terms of quantity, a number of non-conforming lots in this neighborhood, or high number, but they are concentrated within one particular area of the neighborhood. And the image on the left is the block shown here. You can see there are 2 examples of properties that are deemed combined. And Matt, can you remind us what the orange shade means?
Yeah, orange is vacant lots. So
okay, yeah. So the pink color is when it's just the combination of the purple and orange combined. So that's a lot that's both non-conforming and vacant.
And it's important to note that all those orange lots that are not pink you're able to build on those currently without any public engagement.
Right. So what I want to take and point out here, it's a little bit easier to digest perhaps, is that the property at the top left corner of the block that is a pink unbuilt lot, and then the purple one next to it that does have a house on it. What our current regulations say is you can only have the one house, and that you can only build on the pink one if you get a variance or if you go through a major subdivision process. And what we are saying is why go through that process when what they're trying to do is consistent with the pattern of other houses on the same block. And as you can see, the other houses on the same block have very similar footprints and sizes, very similar lot sizes and lot widths. And we are trying to make it easier to reestablish that or reuse that existing pattern instead of making it hard to go to reestablish that existing pattern, which is what the current ordinances do. And I hope that that is clear, but I'm happy to try to touch on that again. Let's take a look at Pendleton Heights and Scarrett. I do know that in the case of Pendleton Heights, there was a downzoning in that neighborhood maybe 10 to 15 years ago that resulted in a number of the lots being non-conforming. There are also a number of homes that were converted to apartments in that neighborhood. And I think that one of the main intents in speaking with the planner that worked on that downzoning was to try to weed out the houses that had been converted to apartments. In the course of downzoning, though, we made these lots non-conforming, which again makes reusing those non-conforming lots or improving the home on the non-conforming lot more difficult.
Can you clarify on what that downzoning was, if it allowed apartments or not? Going from Cynthia's question in the chat.
Yeah, I believe that my understanding, I wasn't here at the time, but my understanding and speaking with the planner who worked on that downzoning was that the main intent was to try to, it had been legal to take homes and convert them to apartments. The zoning allowed that. So they downzoned the neighborhood, which had the effect of making that building type, making apartments illegal, which was the objective. But in the course of doing that, because the zoning a zoning district not only regulates the building type that's allowed, it also regulates the lot sizes that are allowed. We made a lot of the lots non-conforming because the lot size requirement went up. So it went from a 2,500 or 4,000 square foot lot requirement to a 6,000 or 7,500 square foot lot requirement. And that's just the way it is with zoning. That's how it's bundled. What we're talking about is not changing the uses and the building types that are allowed, but making the lots legal so that a permitted building type or use can be established on that lot. This is the East 23rd PAC area. You can see there's a lot of widespread non-conforming lots here. And I want to be very, non-conforming lot it's a very bureaucratic word and it sounds kind of scary to some people. It doesn't mean that your home is, going to be taken away or that something's illegal about your house per se. It just means that you have to make it conforming before you can do something like build a new house, expand the existing house, or make it right in one of the ways we previously described. But what you see here is another block where the pattern's a bit different than some of the other neighborhoods. You have some lots that are large and some that are small, and you might say there's not really much of a consistent pattern perhaps with this particular block. But that's why we wanted to show it to you so that you could see that there are circumstances where there isn't a pattern, and it'll help explain why we propose the regulations we propose. This is the Likens neighborhood. We have had a number of variances in this neighborhood lately for lots that have been sold to various nonprofits who have desired to build homes on the lots that were previously owned by Homestead Authority or Land Bank. And the result is that they were deemed combined because they were under common ownership from the Land Bank or Homesteading Authority. And the only way for them to build more than one house on the multiple lots that were combined was to obtain a variance and go through that process. This is a block you see here where most of the lots are non-conforming in purple. So most of these people would encounter an issue with trying to obtain some sort of permit to maintain their home or to build a new one. This is the Indian Mound area. There is not as much deemed combined situations here, which is good because that certainly eliminates one barrier, but there's still a concentration in certain areas of non-conforming lots. Okay, so we want to talk a bit about what these standards would discourage. So what we show here on the left is I apologize, it's a bit hard to see, but on the left aerial photograph on the right side of the street is a home under construction. And the home is built over 3 lots. And the reason why is because they couldn't reestablish the 3 lots. They were deemed combined, and the path that they had to take to reestablish the 3 lots, they determined as being too risky. So what they chose to do is build one house on the 3 lots. And you know, the cost of land is a significant factor in the cost of housing. And in order to make their numbers work, they felt like it would be necessary to build a very large house. There's currently no incentive for them to establish smaller lots because we make it hard through our current policies. And there is no requirement that the house be compatible in scale to what's around it. So what is being built is what you see here in the top right. It is much wider than the existing homes in the neighborhood because it's built across the 3 lots. It has a 2-bay garage, and it is a 3-story home. And what you see, it's hard to see on the left, but there is a 1.5-story house on the left. And then across the street are 2 1-story shotgun style houses. This is what our current ordinance allows. What our proposed ordinance would discourage a home of this scale from being built simply by having a cap on the regulations of what you can build. You cannot exceed certain building heights and widths because you have to be similar in size and scale to the homes around you, but also making it easier to create those 3 lots. We believe that it's more appropriate contextually for someone to build on 3 lots in the case of this block and smaller homes, because that is the pattern of what was initially built in this neighborhood. This is another example across the street and you can see the footprint of the home under construction relative to the footprints of the homes adjacent to it. Again, this is allowed. These are actual homes in Kansas City. This is allowed, and there's no public engagement at all required for this under the current ordinance. What the proposed ordinance would encourage is homes that are similar in scale. So what you see here, you've seen this image before. This is just a closer view of 2 new homes under construction between 2 existing homes. You can see that they're almost exactly the same height and size, if not slightly smaller than the existing homes. Other points of concern, there was a question asked of whether we're taking feedback. We are. We have heard some feedback from specific areas of the community we have already met with, and we have taken that into consideration, and those are reflected in these 4 standards, which we are proposing to add to our amendment. One is stating that if an improved alley is present, in other words, the alley is actually built, then driveways from the street are prohibited. And when an alley is not present, you can only have a driveway from the street if 50% of the homes on the same block also have a driveway from the street. That's a complaint that we've heard, is that many of the homes being built have 2- and 3-car garages, but the rest of the homes on the block don't have a driveway, let alone a garage. Another one is garage doors on attached garages visible from the street. shall not occupy more than 40% of the ground level of the building. That's related to the first one. That's out of concern for 3 and 4 car garages on a house on a street where very few other houses have any garages at all. Another one is ensuring that number 3 here is that detached garages. So like if you have a garage from your alley, it needs to be in the rear yard. We have had some people want to build it in the side yard. And right now that's encouraged, frankly, because people cannot sell that side lot to someone to build a house on. So they use it to build a garage on for themselves or for the house they're building. Number 4, infill residential lots on block faces with 2 or fewer developed lots shall follow the conventional standards, reduced by 25%. And the reason that's important is because these standards are context-based. So if there's no other homes on the block, and we have a few areas of the city where there's whole block faces where there's no homes at all, but the lots are non-conforming. In that case, there's no context to follow, so you need to follow our existing standards. And that's what this is saying. You don't get to take advantage of the infill development standards because there's nothing to base it off of. All right, one more point of question and answer. Matt, have we gotten anything in the chat or Q&A?
I asked a question in the chat, but you addressed it already.
Okay.
Yeah, Claus just asked a question. Would there be any allowance for multiple tiny homes on a specific lot?
This is neutral with regard to that, because tiny houses under our ordinance are a building type. So they would only be allowed in zoning districts that already allow them. In other words, this ordinance does not make it easier or harder to do tiny houses.
That's it from the chat so far.
Okay. We do have a few more things to wrap up, and we can still take a couple questions at the end. So we've talked about what this isn't. We just want to be very clear. What we're trying to do here is we're trying to create more opportunities for accessible and affordable housing. While it is not an affordable housing ordinance by any means, the hope is that if we open this up to making it to where more than just a large scale or big time developer can do this type of work, that the end result will be ultimately that there's more housing provided, and the more housing that's provided, generally speaking, the more affordable it will be because there's more being provided by the market. We also want to reduce the barriers by reducing the requirements for entitlement processes for first time and incremental developers. There's also, keep in mind, the individual homeowner who might want to be doing some work on their existing house that we're trying to help out as well. We're trying to make use of our existing infrastructure. It costs all of us as taxpayers and residents of Kansas City a lot to maintain our roads and our sewers and our water lines and our street lights. And we have areas of the community where there's no development paying taxes, but yet we have to maintain our blocks and our neighborhoods. And we think that it's wise to make it a bit more streamlined to utilize that infrastructure. And that's what this ordinance might help achieve. And this is what we can do right now. There's a lot of big ideas that are totally worth pursuing, and we're not opposing that. But what we're trying to resolve is a problem as we see it, as a problem that came to exist a few years ago that is within our control with your feedback. And so this is what we're proposing right now. And again, as Matt mentioned earlier, we are open to taking feedback. This is a starting point. So whatever input you guys have, we're all ears. So again, what we did today is we did some introductions. We talked about the purpose of the meeting and what our limitations are. The next step is what I'll touch on next. We have a few more neighborhood meetings like this one with other neighborhoods in other areas of the city. And then the goal or the plan is to present a modified version of this ordinance based upon your feedback to the City Planning Commission at their second meeting in May, which I believe is May 17th. Matt, if you could confirm that date, that would help. And then at some point in June, the City Council would take this under consideration. It's possible that the commission will want to, at their May meeting, will want to discuss it and then continue it before they make a recommendation to council. But ultimately, it will be up to City Council to approve. And then once it's approved, it would become effective, and we would be implementing on a case-by-case basis with each permit.
You're correct with that date.
All right. So this kind of final opportunity to ask questions if anyone has any additional. And I do see a couple more chats. So let's see. Okay, so Cynthia's asking where are tiny houses allowed? So we have
Joe,
cottage
can you
houses.
hear me now?
Yes. Yeah, let me answer.
Go
I
ahead.
started to answer
I-
Cynthia's
yep.
question, so if I can go ahead and finish that, and then we'll turn it over to you. Tiny houses, Cynthia, are called cottage houses in our zoning code, and they are allowed anywhere. To qualify to build one, you have to build at least 4, but no more than 12. And the zoning has to allow the density that you're asking for. So the building type is allowed in most residential zoning districts, but the density of building between 4 and 12 is not allowed in most zoning districts. It's kind of, I wish I could give a more direct answer than that. They're allowed, the building type is allowed in most places throughout the city. Whether it can actually be built in most places depends significantly upon the size of the property and the zoning district that it's on. Does that help? Oh, you said okay. Okay. Tiffany, go ahead if you're able to.
Yes, sure. Apologies. Miles where that happened, and that's exactly when I drove through that. So I'll be very quick because I don't know what you heard before, but that I have are applying well-intended approaches to communities and neighborhoods that need to incentivize more development to areas of the city that might be impacted differently. As a longtime resident of the Country Club District and familiarity with a lot of what Nichols did in each of the different neighborhoods, they all have existing rules. They were all built with, each block has a set of rules, and those are difficult for us to explain to people as it is. Some of the things included in this revision would make that more confusing. And those are the unintended consequences that I think need to be considered for areas of the city that have non-conforming lots and development happening on existing properties, right? So we don't have as many vacant lots in other parts of the city, but still have similar activities. The property owner, in many cases, is a developer, is a flipper. This is a phenomenon that many communities, including the one that I've lived in for a long time, have been struggling with. We have a proposal that you're kind of trying to be consistent across. Many of those homes have unpermitted construction. But as a neighborhood where I have lived for a long time, when we go and speak in regard to a variance request, fight very hard to make sure that the unpermitted construction on adjacent properties is not considered as the basis, because many property owners buy a home and say, well, that house has XYZ. And then we have to explain to them that what they have is unpermitted and is actually a zoning violation as it stands. And so having language that says we're going to take the houses on 100 feet each side and sort of use that as context, again, without the neighborhood in there pointing out that that's unpermitted and is not in alignment with the deed restrictions, could have a different impact in a different part of the city.
Okay. Not trying to put anyone on the spot, but there's a few people we haven't heard from, and now's a good time for you to share any feedback or ask any questions that you have.
Joe, I'm
If you-
going to ask the two people that are on as participants to join as a panelist. They can accept it if they wish or remain if they have any questions, but I'm going to ask you.
So Matt's saying he's going to promote the panelists or the attendees if they're interested in speaking. I see that Cynthia asked some questions, but I believe those were asked before she said that we already answered them. So I believe we've answered her questions. And it looks like Cynthia's good. Thanks, Cynthia, for confirming. Matt has shared a link to the non-conforming parcel map. It's just good to get on there and explore your block or your neighborhood. And please feel free to follow up with any questions to me and my staff. I'll ask that Matt drop our email addresses into the chat here. There's a team of us working on this that are all four equally knowledgeable. So any of the four of us can help answer your questions. Matt is one, me and Matt are just two of them. We also have Najma Muhammad, who's out ill today and couldn't make it, who's very familiar with this and can be contacted. And Anna Naniski is the other planner. And again, we'll provide you with their contact information. We realize this is a lot of information, a lot to take in. So we would totally understand if anyone needed to take a few days to absorb some of this, and then we'll have some follow-up questions. Please do not hesitate to reach out to us. All right, so we'll go ahead and wrap this up because it looks like we're not getting any more questions. We wanted to conclude with how much do you know about infill residential development now? So I guess, is there anything that you learned that you just didn't know at the beginning of this? That's kind of, if you're willing to share, great. And while you're unmuting, if you are going to share, it looks like Cynthia's asking, is there any unintended consequences we can think of? Everything that we've thought of, and I'll just be very straightforward, we've addressed already in the ordinance. That doesn't mean that we believe it's perfect, but we can all of us, if we've written something, that's why we ask someone to proofread it. So you can kind of think of it that way, that we're giving to you something, a draft. If you poke holes in it, great. I mean, we'll try to fix it. But we wrote it and we made a lot of edits to it before we put it out there publicly, because we did see unintended consequences that we had tried to fix. There is one example was doing these separately. Initially, we thought about doing a minor subdivision ordinance separate from the lot and building standards. But what we realized is that it would allow people to reestablish these lots if it were to be passed, the minor subdivision ordinance. And people would just maximize what they can build on an even smaller lot. So you would kind of have the worst of both worlds. And so that was something we definitely wanted to avoid. And that's why we hit the brakes and wrote the context-based standards. We had also considered a number of other options or tools besides the context-based standards. All of them were deemed to be too cumbersome, mainly for neighborhoods, because one of them would have required a neighborhood to upzone or do an overlay district. And we've had a number of neighborhoods do overlay districts, but they frankly tend to be ones that are well-resourced neighborhoods that may have their own staff or have design professionals that live in the neighborhood that are familiar with zoning and are able to write the overlay district themselves. And the effect that that's having is it's pushing some of the what are considered to be undesirable development and land uses to neighborhoods that have fewer resources. And so we saw an equity issue with that. And that's why we did not encourage that or pursue that path. It's not that it's not still it's still an option, but we felt like it was important for us as staff to take a leadership role and propose something that could be used by every neighborhood, so that neighborhoods with fewer resources aren't left in the lurch. Klaus says he learned a little bit. Yeah, there's a lot of nuances. There are. We totally get it. All right, everyone. I think that probably concludes our meeting tonight. Do you understand Tina's point? Oh, Tiffany's point. So Cynthia said, "Do you understand Tina's point?" And then she said the phone call in the chat. So I think she's referring to Tiffany's last point. Yeah, I think and I'm sure Tiffany will let us know if I mischaracterized her, but because she was cutting out just a bit, I was able to capture what I believe what she was trying to say was that some neighborhoods have covenants, which are private standards that the neighborhood can administer. And many of neighborhoods created by J.C. Nichols in and around the plaza were created with covenants. So it is true that those neighborhoods, even though they may have been established before we had subdivision regulations or even zoning regulations, that they do have private rules that apply to the development of those properties. We can't control. What I would say in response to that is I can see how there would be there always is confusion between the city's rules and the covenants with neighborhoods that have them. And I could certainly see how this might add to that confusion. But we don't have control at the city level. We don't have control over those private rules and how they're implemented and managed by the individual neighborhoods. Does anyone have questions about that? I don't know if everyone could catch everything she said, and I may not have characterized it exactly correctly, but that's my understanding of what she was saying.
No, that's accurate, and those covenants are deed restrictions. And as I said, I don't want to not acknowledge the fact that this conversation has a lot of the city with, as Joe said, fewer resources historically even, but just clarifying or pointing out, maybe is a better way to say it, that we're making changes that could just shift where the challenges are, right? Having a block with we have block faces with existing deed restriction covenants in terms of front yard setback, rear yard setback, side setback, the whole 9 yards, and using 100-foot on each side rule within the city, as opposed to what it is right now, which is somewhat similar to those covenants, means that individual property owners on the same block may end up with different requirements because the homes on either side of them would be different. And particularly if we don't have a way to avoid using the unpermitted additions as those benchmark points, it almost makes it does make it more challenging, but it almost makes it more of a free-for-all in places where we have a little bit of a handle on it. And I'm not trying to be specifically focused on just my part of town, but 6th District in general, which is what I know best.
Right. And I think that that's worthy of exploring a bit more, Tiffany, is there's language in the proposed ordinance that says that the homes around the lot in question, whether conforming or not, which I think is what you're referencing about unpermitted work.
Yes.
It says that the non-conforming aspect should also be taken into account. I think it's worth exploring whether we can eliminate that and still have a workable ordinance. So we'll take that under consideration, and we may reach out to you directly with some questions about some of our thoughts with that, and we'd appreciate further dialogue.
Okay. And just from your professional background, Joe, is it absolutely impossible for the zoning ordinance to acknowledge the covenants?
I don't know that it's practically impossible. I believe that it's legally challenging. So I think that's something that we can explore more too. Maybe we can put some sort of, at a minimum, perhaps what we can put in here is that, you know, the property owner needs to first explore any covenants and restrictions that are on the property before they pursue any sort of development on infill lots. So at least that they become aware first and foremost. I mean, we tell people that verbally, but whether they actually do it is a different question. And I don't see why we couldn't do that, but we'll talk with our law department to see what concerns they might have with doing that.
Okay.
If any.
Thank you.
All right, Martha, you can go ahead and reach out. Sounds like you would like to discuss this more. You can reach out to any of the four of us or all four of us, and we're happy to talk with you more offline. Thank you everyone for your time. And now that the sun is setting, hopefully you can enjoy what's left of your evening. And we really appreciate it. And we look forward to more dialogue or feedback from you guys. Thanks a lot.
Thank you. Good night.
Good night.
Thank you.